So welcome to today's webinar, Income Security, Climate Change, and Community Resilience, featuring speakers who are involved in the Green Resilience Project. My name is Laura Schnurr, and I'm the Director of Tamarack's Community Climate Transitions. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on Indigenous land. I myself am calling in from Tiohtià:ke, the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk people. This is the site of the Great Peace of Montreal Treaty, signed in 1701 between New France and 40 Indigenous groups that brought peace to the region for 60 years. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also wanted to acknowledge that tomorrow, May 5th, is the National Day of Awareness and Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, also referred to as Red Dress Day. I encourage you to read through the National Inquiry's final report, if you haven't already, and to look out for events that are hosted by Indigenous-led organizations in your community. And we'll be putting the link to the final report in the chat in a moment. There it is from Jamie, thank you. So I also invite each of you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, including the traditional land from which you're calling in from. And I see we have people already doing that, so that's wonderful. So yeah, if you'd like to just share your name, organization, and where you're calling in from, that would be great. It's great to see everyone, to see such a large group here with us today. So now on to our guest panel, and feel free to take a minute and enter that in the chat, but I'll start introducing our panelists today. So we have with us Alysha Jones, who is the co-chair of the Intersectionality and Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment, CANE, and a member of the District of Sooke's Climate Action Committee. She hosted a Green Resilience Project community conversation in the Sooke region of Vancouver Island. Ana Guerra Marin is the National Chapter Director at Iron and Earth, a worker-led not-for-profit with a mission to empower fossil fuel industry and Indigenous workers to build and implement climate solutions. Iron and Earth was a community partner with the Green Resilience Project and hosted a community conversation in Hinton, Alberta. We have Mitchell Beer, who is a publisher with the Energy Mix, an e-digest on climate change and energy transition. He is a member of the steering committee and a project lead for the Green Resilience Project. And last but certainly not least, Sheila Regehr, who is co-chair of Basic Income Canada Network and is one of its founding members, and is former executive director of the National Council of Welfare. She is a member of the steering committee and the project lead for the Green Resilience Project. All of their full bios are available on our event page, so we'll be dropping that in the chat. There it is already, so you can take a look. Welcome, Alysha, Ana, Mitchell, and Sheila. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. So let's get started here. So you'll be hearing about Green Resilience Project throughout the webinar today, but in a nutshell, the project was intended to explore the ties between livelihoods, incomes, community resilience, and achieving net zero emissions. So during the past few months, 33 local conversations were held across Canada on these topics, and they were hosted by community partners. The final report that summarizes what was heard on this cross-Canada listening tour was just released on April 14th. And all our speakers today are here either as Green Resilience Project leads and members of the steering committee and or community partners who hosted local conversations. And here at Tamarack, we've been following this work closely with great interest, given that we are working at the intersection of these same issues through our campaigns to advance just and equitable climate transitions, end poverty, and strengthen community resilience, as well as supporting youth. So I'm going to start with you, Sheila, for the first question. I'd love to, if you could tell us a bit more about the Green Resilience Project and its goals and why partners felt these were important conversations for us to have at this time.
I have to unmute myself now, right?
There you go.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Tamarack for this opportunity, because we're really excited about this project. So I'll just briefly outline the goals as they were described in the report. So 4 major ones. one, to explore the links between income security, climate change, and community resilience. Get community perspectives on how income security can actually help build resilience and encourage action on the climate crisis. So again, understanding those connections, building conversation and understanding that includes different voices, especially those who are often left out of policymaking. And then we saw this, I think, not as the end of anything, but as a starting point, a catalyst for ongoing advocacy and collaboration. We will confess that our steering committee didn't start from scratch. I mean, we did have some ideas. And among us, many of us had quite deep knowledge of our own field and enough knowledge of the other field to recognize that having these conversations outside of our bubbles really did matter. And that they could be, connecting these things could be essential to the kind of positive solutions, and especially the rapid change we need. So I see, I guess, both of these things, insecurity, inequality, and climate change, as huge, wicked problems that individuals care about. They can have some agency, but it takes collective action. We know that. So that's really important for us to investigate how we do that. When we started out, we had some of our own ideas, but we didn't know that our partners would necessarily agree with us. We weren't looking for cheerleaders, and we didn't know that they would necessarily even be interested. We worked really, really hard to develop the kind of process that we thought would generate really good input, though. Comments that have come back have reaffirmed that. But it's just really rewarding to see how these issues have played out on the ground in different communities, which is what we're looking for. So the key to what we were doing then was to listen. As I said, not looking for cheerleaders, not looking for support for our ideas, but giving people the tools that they needed on the ground to help develop their own reports. So we're rewarded that people came on board. People really adapted and did things differently in different places, and that's really amazing and the kind of thing we wanted. So they then showed us the very particular ways in which climate is impacting people. I mean, lots of things that we never would have thought about. And that led to the common themes and to our recommendations. So it all built up together.
Thanks for that overview. And yeah, the topics explored just incredibly timely. So we're personally really glad that this happened. And Mitchell, I'd like to turn to you and just ask, what were some of the key themes you heard during the community conversations, and what recommendations did you make in the final report?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks once again so much for inviting us today, and everybody for taking the time to be here. I just want to first really reinforce what Sheila said, that we did start out with some ideas, but the way we thought of it was, these are hypotheses, these are ideas, these are things that we expect we might hear. The great thing about a hypothesis is that it's allowed to be wrong, right? If that weren't a possibility, we would call it a conclusion. And if we'd had conclusions, we wouldn't have needed this project. It's allowed to be wrong, and that's good news, and it's a win as long as we learn something about why we got it wrong when we were at the stage of hypothesis. And in this case, we heard back, I think so much echo and reinforcement and just original thinking on some of those original ideas we brought in. But as Sheila said, there's so much more, and so much more wisdom and knowledge and experience, that we got the really tough and joyous task of trying to boil down into 4 themes. And the first was that we're all increasingly exposed to climate impacts, but it's harder when you're also facing financial precarity. And the majority of the participants in our conversation were living the impacts of climate change and income insecurity. Many of them were interested in taking action in their own lives and building resilience in their communities, but they couldn't do it without more time, more funding, more resources. And after the last 2 years that we've all been through, they couldn't do it without getting past their own mental and emotional exhaustion. Second, People want to live in healthy, resilient communities that are prepared to face both the climate crisis and the income insecurity crisis. They're interested in solutions, and people talked about so many solutions that could make or were making a real difference in day-to-day life. Things like affordable local food supplies, healthier housing that uses less energy, better transit, in some communities, any transit, stronger local economies, services, and infrastructure. A great many of the things that make people's lives better can also help deliver the faster, deeper carbon cuts that we need. So a big takeaway is that climate actions that put people and community first are about opportunity and gain, not about loss and pain, which really, I think, turns on its head the narrative that we hear so much about climate change, that, okay, fine, we're going to do this because you've convinced us we have to, but it's going to hurt. So much of it isn't like that, because there's so much opportunity behind the things we need to do, and we can be solving these problems in tandem, as Sheila said. Our third theme shows what it will take to tap into those opportunities. Many local participants were so skeptical that they could take action on climate change or income insecurity because they have so much less influence on big structural systemic issues than corporations and governments. They didn't think governments were doing enough to address these problems, and they didn't think they could get the job done on their own at the grassroots. Several of our local partners reported a sense of hopelessness, apathy, mistrust in the institutions that are supposed to be keeping us and our communities safe and well. As one of our partners in Sault Ste. Marie put it, it's not like we're lacking in the people wanting to make these changes. We just aren't the people who have the power to do it. And we heard that again and again in so many ways, in so many communities. But the fourth theme was the equal and opposite of that. The communities are ready to step up if they have the support and the resources to create the change that we need. That creates a challenge and an opportunity for governments to deliver the transformative policies that address the root causes of climate change and income insecurity, I should say, and empower communities to take self-directed action. So hearing all of that, again, just having the task and the joy and the honor of getting to compile it all, we wanted to deliver a set of recommendations that would keep faith with what we had heard from communities and would have the most immediate and lasting impact in supporting that positive transformation and helping to build greater resilience across the country. And we came up with 4 recommendations. The first, incorporating basic income in the plan for a just transition off fossil fuels. Secondly, designing income security and climate policies that improve quality of life for individuals and communities. Third, empowering people and communities with the tools and resources they need to build or strengthen resilience. And then finally, ensuring the corporations and the wealthy pay their fair share. I will just add that with Ontario starting its election today, we've got 4 weeks, and these are urgent needs and principles that any of the provincial parties should be able to incorporate into their platforms through whatever ideological lens they bring to the campaign. Our work was nonpartisan, it was multi-partisan, it was cross-partisan, and there was nothing we heard or concluded that should not have the place in any policy set of any stripe. So if we find in this province over the next 4 weeks that any of the parties can't or won't incorporate these essential messages, then that should be a message to all of us. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, thank you for that summary. And really across those themes that you shared is just this notion that people want to take action for their communities to be more resilient. They want climate action as well, but they face these systemic barriers to doing so, right? And that governments in particular need to act. That's such a powerful message. Thank you. I want to turn to you, Ana, because you hosted a community conversation in Hinton, a town of around 10,000 people in West Central Alberta with both historical and current dependency on resource industries. So I'd love to know who attended this session you hosted and what were the themes that came up, and also to what extent were those themes consistent with those heard from across the country that Mitchell just outlined.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everybody. I'm not sure why it's not showing on my Zoom, but I go by she, her, just letting you all know. And I'm currently talking to you from the lands of the Lekwungen people, represented by the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, also known as Victoria, British Columbia. It was very interesting, and Sheila mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, is that community partners had a lot of freedom to sort of take the scripts and the ideas of the Green Resilience Project and then modify them to their communities, right? And so, as Laura mentioned, Hinton is a very interesting town that currently has oil and gas, coal, thermal coal, mostly extraction. They have a strong forestry industry, and they're right by the Rockies. So there's also like a very strong sort of tourism environmental component also all together in the land. We managed to get people from different sectors, including the extractive industries. We did manage to get gender parity just within the binary of men and women. And we try to include voices from all across sectors, which, you know, it was a little difficult, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but COVID was also a hindrance. So it was January in Alberta, and Omicron was like breaking havoc everywhere. So we're just really grateful to people who showed up. And so that's kind of like the participants. And it was very interesting in a way, because although we recognized that there was nobody that self-identified as racialized or part of the LGBTQ2S community, we were actually representative of the census for Hinton, at least the old version, because the new version hasn't come out yet. We're waiting for it. And then the themes, it was very interesting because we try to, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but like we tailor the narratives to what would resonate within rural Alberta. And because of that, we really decided, for instance, not to touch base on basic income, or we decided not to touch base on something like, for instance, resilience. So like, but actually what we found from participants was that they actually brought it up. So although it wasn't the main themes that we identified, it was brought up by participants, which I think is quite interesting because it does change that narrative that says, oh, it's just basic income, it's just a progressive thing, nobody wants to talk, you know, all these narratives are, they're polarizing narratives. From themes that we identified, the priority was diversification of industry, which is basically just transition. Also that the transition needs to have economic, environmental, and social component. People were very outspoken about the need of cultural, social, mental health, all these components that normally are not, we don't normally associate with government plans for economic transitions. And people were really, really, really keen to express that that was needed, because the next like sort of theme that we found was that they wanted balance. So they wanted a balance between the economy and the environment. And because there's this narratives that say, well, if you support extractive industries, then you're against the environment. And if you're pro-environment, then you're against the extractive industries. And so they're really familiar with that. And they said, no, we need to balance it out. We need to find a way that our economy is, I mean, I would like to call it circular economy. That's kind of what we all want to get. But they brought up concepts that relate to that. Is how do we make it sort of comprehensive and inclusive? And then I would say the final theme would be that they want to be participants of the change. And they see another thing, for instance, we did is that we really didn't mention government, but they brought up government. And they see, well, government can be a big help, but it can also be a hindrance. So they're trying to see it as like, okay, we want local government, provincial government, federal government, and we want to have a stake on this. We want to be participants. So I think that's a little bit I can sum up. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's really great to hear that even in Alberta, we heard a lot of the same themes that we hear across the country, right? That's really encouraging, even if you did use different language. And that's something I'd like to come back to later in this conversation. But first, I want to pass it to Alysha. So I have the same question for you. You hosted 2 conversations in the Sooke region of Vancouver Island. What was the profile of participants there, and what were some key themes surfaced?
Sure, thanks, Laura. First, I just wanted to say thanks so much to the Green Resilience Project team and the Tamarack Institute. I'm grateful to have participated in the GRP and in this panel. I'm a community health nurse, and I think that nurses' involvement in climate, in community resilience, in community discussions and development and questions of income and affordability is key. It's really important given how intertwined these issues are with health and wellness. So the Green Resilience Project conversation I held in the Sooke region actually turned out to be a series of conversations. So from 2 to 18 people, I held 4 small conversations in the town of Sooke, a more informal conversation at the local high school, and then a conversation in the village of Shirley, which is next door to Sooke. So for participants not familiar with the Sooke region, Sooke is a town of about 15,000 people on the southwest corner of so-called Vancouver Island. Amazing ecology of forest and ocean and biodiversity. Just a stunning place. That all that charismatic megafauna of BC, the whales and the cougar and the bear are here. Shirley is to the west of us. It's a village of about 500 people, and again in this stunning ecological place. And in this region, the social, the economic, and the environmental geography are changing quite quickly due to a rapid population growth and land conversion and development. Of course, that's been going on for several hundred years since the arrival of settler colonialism here and its impacts on people and land. The word Sooke is an anglicization of the Sanchothan word Sauk, which is the name of the nation in this territory. And of course, people have lived here for many thousands of years, long before colonial policies of dispossession and erasure. I really want to name that because I held these conversations in unceded Sauk territory. And the Sauk Nation, small nation of about 200, have been real green leaders in Canada, the most solar intensive community in Canada, incredibly, and also a mentorship community for other nations in terms of energy autonomy and a cultural resurgence and economic autonomy in these ways. So Chief Gordon Planis speaks about a 100-year plan for energy autonomy. So for the non-Indigenous community here in Sooke, which was largely participants in the conversations I held are non-Indigenous, we need to be looking to the Sauk Nation for their leadership and their green leadership and following their lead in this. And that's been, I heard that from participants in the conversations. And I also hear that on the Climate Action Committee in Sooke and from the municipal government. So in terms of the profile of participants, I didn't intend it this way, but it did largely turn out to be folks over 65 and youth. So that was most of the participants. And then folks falling in between there in working people who are small business owners, people in healthcare, people working in agriculture, and people who self-identified as members of the LGBTQ+ community, as well as people who self-identified as persons with disabilities and of lower income, but largely a white middle class group. And we know that the youth and seniors are going to experience disproportionate impacts of climate change, just given vulnerability to health, chronic health issues, fixed incomes, and then given our current trajectory, worsening of climate change impacts in years to come, which youth will unfortunately bear the burden of. So intergenerational equity is a big sort of focus, at least coming from the conversations that I held, and I'll mention that at the end there. So what did I hear mostly? I heard stories of grief and gratitude from Sooke and Shirley residents. So grief, people expressed anger, anxiety, and grief about damage to the land, loss of forest and biodiversity through development and the intensification of traffic, the loss of agricultural land, the loss of community and identity and integrity. Again, I'm talking about the primarily settler community, community identity and integrity as more and more people commute because they don't have a living wage job in Sooke. And participants expressed concerns about mental health impacts around these issues for themselves, their fellow citizens, and particularly for youth who may not have a future living in Sooke due to unaffordable housing and lack of living wage jobs. So one participant said, all the best agricultural lands running through Sooke are being gobbled up by subdivisions that my kids can't possibly afford. Someone else said, we need therapy as a community to grieve through this process, the loss of green space and agricultural land, because we love it here. So this is the gratitude part, and we want to do everything to be positive contributing members. So in terms of gratitude, a number of participants spoke about just love for the place, wanting to step into stewardship in that. And really appreciate what we've got here. And a big part of that was the development of local economic infrastructure and a local circular economy here. I'll mention that in just a second. Participants were really concerned about a lack of robust infrastructure here. So in terms of energy, we're dependent on BC's mainland for electrical power and energy. Transportation, we have one highway into and out of Sooke, which although we were not impacted certainly anywhere near other places in the world and even the lower mainland of British Columbia during the atmospheric river and floodings that occurred there, we did have the closure of our road. And in terms of bringing in food, which we, predominantly import, that's the way in and out. But mainly people spoke about not having the employment or local economic infrastructure to support the living wage, that keeping it in Sooke, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that would come from local economic, a robust economy here. So people said, a youth participant said, they're building a lot of houses in Sooke, but there's no infrastructure and no jobs to support people living here. So there's lots of driving, lots of commuting, and people can't seem to make enough money anyway. So there's this cycle of unaffordability undermining community resilience. On the other hand, people really spoke about the need for strengthening the local economy and local food security, and how these things will feed one another. Of course, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions with a more robust local economy, strengthening mental health, strengthening community cohesion, and building up a sense of integrity within the community. Lots of creative ideas. Community members were really quite positive and optimistic, both about how the Sooke community can come together around this, but also about the actions of the municipal government, which is slightly different than I think some of the other conversations of the GRP across Canada. Folks here in Sooke that participated, at least in these conversations, are really felt quite a bit of positivity about the work of the municipal government and what they're up to. And hopefulness, and also feeling like there's an almost accessible engagement for community members with the municipal government. I don't want to take too much time here, but I'll speak briefly about the Shirley conversation. A very different community, much, much smaller, of course. For Shirley residents, one main concern is just the deforestation, practices of deforestation occurring in that area as development increases. And creating vulnerability to climate change, of course, drought, fires, and flooding, and then the rising costs that occur with forestry practices for people living in Shirley, the impacts on their wells, the impacts on their pumps, simple things, particularly for seniors living in Shirley. And people spoke about, the resurgence of local agriculture and farming in Shirley is something incredibly positive. And again, the resonance with Sooke, the need for a strong local economy and development. Again, needing government to be a part of that and to stimulate that, and also community members to participate in that. Again, a lot of positivity, but Shirley residents really had a ton of positivity about coming together and doing these things, feeling they're such a small community, they could really work on it together. So some resonance, definitely good resonance with other GRP conversations, and then some slight nuanced differences.
Thank you. I know it's a challenge to summarize not only one community conversation, but two in such a short time, but really appreciate that. And loved hearing what the Sooke Nation is doing and their 100-year plan. It made me think of 7 generations thinking and how we could use a lot more of that in policy making. And it doesn't really align with political cycles, but something that we need to work on. So Sheila, I'm going to turn to you now, because the Green Resilience Project partners made a really intentional decision to use a community conversation format to hear from diverse voices across Canada. I want to ask you why this was important to you and what were some benefits to this approach.
Thanks, Laura. Yes, it really was very, very important to all of us on the steering committee. We come from different backgrounds ourselves, different reasons. So I'm going to answer this from my own perspective. I am the quintessential boring policy wonk. I worked inside the federal government for decades, but I also headed an independent advisory body, as you mentioned at the beginning, the National Council of Welfare. And so with my work throughout being inside the federal government and then independently as well, have been part of many, many different consultations done in different ways. And what is really, really clear to me from my experience of like tearing my hair out every other day sometimes in frustration, is that public policy, good public policy, doesn't get made by politicians. It doesn't get made by academics. It doesn't get made by public servants. It doesn't even get made by non-governmental organizations. It takes all of them combined. It takes everybody working together to figure out how we do this. And I mean, quite frankly, I saw too many places where people thought they had the ideas, and if you're on the inside and you have power, you run with what makes sense to you. And when we went out and actually talked to people, I mean, it just got so many examples where I said, like, you could have just asked people and you'd have gotten you'd have made this policy better. It would have been more effective. You wouldn't have had the problems you ended up with. So it really, developing any kind of public policy takes some understanding of what real life is like for ordinary people. And people who live and work in ivory or public service towers don't always get that. They also don't get the complexity and diversity of people's lives. So that to us was really, really essential because, you know, something so often in these conversations that are getting more and more polarized, something looks really obvious to somebody and really not obvious to somebody else. We need to talk about these things together. So that was the goal, getting people out of their bubbles, bringing people together. I think Alysha mentioned in her situation, and it wasn't the only situation, it happened on the East Coast as well, that there was quite a difference in age between some of the conversations. So in one conversation in Nova Scotia, it was generally a group of older people, and another one was in a high school, which was generally younger people. The things you got out of both of those groups were equally valid, but really, really different. And you need to put it together, and you need to do that to understand what your community looks like. Other examples of things that were really different, I think it was in New Brunswick, but I'm not sure. I have a terrible memory. I'm one of those older folks, where it very quickly became apparent to the group how much race intersected with climate and income in their community for some of those participants. But in another instance, in inner city Toronto, what was really interesting was this was largely a community of color, many immigrants, people from around the world, really, really dense. And the key issue that came up for them was time poverty. It wasn't about race, it was about time. Nobody has time to do the things we need to do to secure our own livelihoods, to do the climate projects that we'd like to do to bring in more sustainable practices in our own community. So, I mean, the bottom line is the best insights come from the questions that nobody thought to ask going in. You get the best answers.
Absolutely, 100%. And anyone who's familiar with Tamarack will know that we're huge proponents of community engagement. And so we certainly appreciate that you took that approach. Now, Anna, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned in your introductory remarks around the fact that you tailored some of the language that was included in the script so that it would really resonate in the Alberta context. Terms like climate change, basic income, just transition can be polarizing. Can you share a bit more about that?
Sure. Well, this is the thing. I think Sheila just brought it up. It's like, for me, even though we had these questions to give to Green Resilience Project, my goal of the session was actually have a session that participants in Alberta felt comfortable, cared, and heard, and it was talking about climate change. Because we all know, you know, there's a lot of negative, right? So like the climate emergency, the world is on fire, so that's all of that, which is real. And then there is what the politicians are saying, specifically in the Alberta context, also federal, but like in the Alberta context, you know, how the premier has spoken about these issues. I don't want to go deeper into that. But so it was like, okay, can we actually have conversations with people in Alberta and actually have fruitful conversations and see where people are at and kind of put apart those narratives that are being presented. Also the ideas about Alberta, because there's a lot of ideas that come like, oh, well, Alberta people are doing this, or Alberta people are thinking that, or Alberta people are doing that. And I was like, well, is it true? The other thing that I wanted to bring up, sort of just to introduce about the narratives, is that I'm a person that, for instance, Sheila just spoke about grief, right? So like there, and we saw it on the Green Resilience Project final report. There's a lot of grief, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of anxiety. And so when I read, I was like, we need to figure out where our community is at the base level to see, for instance, if we even talk about resilience. Because if people have so much grief, why are we asking them to be prepared for climate change? Why don't we just allow a space for people to grieve and, you know, and to the end of their normalcy? Because it is the end of the normalcy for a lot of us in many ways, whether we agree with that normalcy or not. And so there's a lot of sort of concepts that I was thinking, okay, like, am I even allowed to talk about resilience in a community when I don't even know if they have, you know, if they're ready to talk about it? Or am I like, what would I bring a community if I talk about just transition, the term? Because unfortunately, even though just transition, the term is not political, it has been politicized by the fact that we are waiting for the Just Transition Act. And other political parties are using that just transition as an idea of liberal politics, as in the Liberal Party, right? So like, I was just trying to like weed out all those narratives and like, just, okay, we're going to have a community and it's going to be community centered. I'm going to worry about Hinton. I'm going to worry about what has happened in the past couple of years, what we have seen in Hinton regards to climate, and just start from there. And it was quite a positive experience where people actually felt cared for, felt heard. They were able to talk about these issues in their own language. They were able to, they felt like, you know, our feedback forms, and even within the sessions, people were like, oh, I was so reticent to come here. I just didn't want to, and I'm feeling so great. I feel like, you know, I'm empowered. Like our feedback forms also brought that up. And so like, that's kind of what I wanted to take from. So like that sort of diverged a little bit about sort of how the Green Resilience was, but also because of how the project was set up, then it allowed me to do that, because you know how it is when we're talking about funding and you know, project goals that are so rigid that you don't really have change to like breathe or go about. So I am really grateful that the folks of the Green Resilience Project were like, no, you know what? Do whatever you want. We just want this 4 questions answered. And so that gave us a lot of opportunity for experiments. And the last part I want to bring up, is that I personally, and I think we all are, I'm tired of just the idea of consultation. So like what I wanted to do is a conversation to build a relationship. So for us, the Green Resilience Project was actually our pilot project. So like we wanted to see how a community session would work. And if my ideas were not a little bit out there, which tend to happen, because basically what I see is like, the way United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous People talk about free, informed, and prior consent. So what most project leads, whether it's nonprofit, government, whatever, that just means consultation. So they bring a project to a region, and I'm not just talking Indigenous folks, Indigenous peoples across this many nations. They just say, oh, well, we're gonna bring, toilets to this community. I don't know. My best example is toilets. I'm sorry, but it's like, and so they do the consultation, and then so, well, okay, we check that box, toilets. We told the community, and then they install the toilets. But then, what if the community doesn't really like the toilets? Maybe they just have a different way to go to the bathroom, and so the toilets are going to turn out to be chairs. They're going to be, potter, to put plants on it. And so I'm trying to move away from that idea that we just bring a project to a community, we do a consultation, and then voila, the project happens. So the idea we had is that, okay, let's start talking about it. And then we're going to come back to the community, and with the results we had, we're going to keep talking about it. And then hopefully we're going to allow them to make decisions for themselves to choose what climate solutions they get. And so that's kind of how as you see, my ideas were a little bit beyond the Green Resilience Project. So that's why I did a lot of narrative playing. But at the same time, I was able to answer the questions, and we were able to get what we needed, because this is what people are talking about. This is what people need is. And what the final thing I want to say about this is that we see it, whatever, if you read the report, if you go through the community reports, when you link climate change to your economy, when you link it to your everyday life and how it affects you, and mostly is related to the economy, you find a lot of similarities across communities. So sometimes when we think about climate change, it's this abstract thing. It's like over there. But when we're seeing how it affects our income security, when we have a drought last year, or as Alysha mentions, there was the flood. And so obviously we were not in the Lower Mainland, but obviously we couldn't get our packages. Our food prices went through the roof, because I'm also in Vancouver Island. And so I experienced it. It was our town wasn't flooded, but our food disappeared. So we're seeing it. And by doing that, we can sort of bring conversations across communities in Canada from different ideas, different personal, beliefs, or whether it's faith beliefs or political beliefs. And we actually can manage to get conversations about climate because we're making it personal. We are talking to people about what they hurt them. And I think that that's very important, because no matter what kind of climate campaigning we do, if people need to get money to pay food, for rent, if they need money for survival, the climate will take a second stage. It's never going to be the priority we want them to be, because we need to survive. And so that's kind of my spiel, I think.
There was a lot there. Thank you. That was really great. Really appreciate it, Ana. And yeah, I think that's such a great point you ended with, just the importance of making the links really visible, and exposing these intersections is not only important from a perspective of creating effective policies, but also really for making it real for people individually. So thanks. And also that point about people need to feel cared for, really appreciated that. I think that's so key. It also made me think, as you were speaking about the language in Alberta, about the Alberta Narratives Project, just putting the link in the chat box for people. That was such a great report from a couple of years ago. And I think we often talk about the need to tailor language in Alberta, but I think it's kind of equally true as we think just across the country, and geographically, but also with different groups. We just need to be thinking about what language works and what how we should be approaching these issues. So certainly not, I didn't want to frame this as exclusively an Alberta issue. Now I wanted to ask Alysha, quite a bit on this webinar so far, we've been speaking about mental health issues have been coming up. And I wanted to ask you, in your role with the Canadian Association for Nurses for the Environment, you're keenly aware of how climate change and income security are impacting people's health and vice versa. So could you speak a bit more about the health dimensions of this issue?
Sure, I can. Yeah, Laura. And I think, Sheila, you had referenced this wicked problem of climate change, and it certainly is. It spans everything and includes everything, and has also been called the greatest threat to human health of the 21st century. So massive public health threat and health emergency, as we know. We've heard these narratives probably, impacts of heat waves and wildfires and flooding and changes in food production on human health and wellness, including mental health. And dislocation from territory and place, which is something Indigenous people have dealt with for so long, and this just increasing now at this point. I several years ago was working up in northern BC in Tahltan territory after a massive wildfire had gone through those nations' communities, and people were displaced for about 6 months from their community, living in hotels and other places, and the impacts of that on mental health and well-being and social cohesion are quite huge. And we know that these health impacts are not equitably experienced. They're felt differently depending on geography, and depending on race, and ethnicity, and gender and age, and whether one struggles with a disability, whatever it may be, but particularly those social determinants of health that we know of. So socioeconomic status is one of those determinants of health that most impacts people's health. It impacts food security, it impacts housing and mental health. And so we know that people struggling with income and poverty, low income and poverty, are going to be more impacted by climate change. So there's this intersection, obviously, of the economic, the social, and the health pieces. At the Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment, so we're a small group of nurses and all volunteers. Organization's been around for, I think, since 2008. So nurses just working off the side of the desk, and so have been looking at environmental health, but increasingly environmental racism. And so in the chat box there was linked Ingrid Waldron's work. So really looking at her incredible work, the disproportionate impacts on health and mental health that environmental racism causes, and we can, climate change and climate justice is a part of this as well. So increasingly at CANE, we're looking at how can we participate in nurses being more involved in addressing climate justice and environmental racism, environmental justice activities, because there's been very little, at least explicit involvement. So my involvement in the Green Resilience Project was really spurred on by that, in part, that I really see a role for nurses to play in this. These incredibly wicked and complex issues, and how they all come together, and health is inevitably intertwined with it, and justice and health being, sides of a coin.
Absolutely. No, thanks. And I noticed throughout the report, just such a focus on especially youth mental health, and all the challenges around that. And this mental health crisis that we're seeing is really rooted in both the climate crisis itself, but also the financial precarity and that young people face, and the uncertainty around what the future holds. So, speaking of that kind of uncertainty around the future, I'm thinking about the last couple of years and how much has changed since you started designing this project. And I wanted to ask you, Mitchell, when this series of community conversations was initially being designed, we were living in a very different world. So to what extent did the context change in the past year, and what impact do you think that had on the conversations?
Thanks, Laura. So of course, before the pandemic, we were already living with the climate emergency and the affordability crisis, and we knew that they both needed to be dealt with urgently. The pandemic response was supposed to be about all of us being in it together. Remember those days? And about leaving no one behind. Remember that messaging? Until we found out from experience that it only amplified the inequality and the precarity that had already been there before. So then you might recall that the pandemic was supposed to be about building back better, until far too much of the investment went into fossil fuel infrastructure rather than clean alternatives. And then, not to take too much time on it, but there were a couple of other things going on as well. The occupations, not just in Ottawa, but in other parts of the country in February, were many things. but they were also a very real reflection of the frustration and the rage so many people feel, the despair, the grief about the very same inequalities and disconnects that we've been hearing about right through the community conversations. The difference here, though, was that the community concern during the occupation was being channeled into violence and intimidation, and that showed how easy it was for a group of far-right extremists and conspiracy theorists to channel the pandemic experience into a declaration that, if you recall, was led by Nazi and 3%er and Confederate flags that essentially called for the overthrow of a duly elected government. Then when being in Ottawa in particular, we were about 3 kilometers from ground zero for all of that. And right through January, February, I know in some cases we were just channeling and showing this too much from here that we couldn't have imagined anything being more central until days later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And along with everything else that meant, has meant, still means, pulled much of the world's attention away from discussions of climate change and income security, while creating price spikes for food and energy that hit hardest for the people who are already most vulnerable before and during the pandemic. The war also helped build a false narrative that we need more new fossil fuel projects and pipelines to help Europe free itself from Russian oil and gas. And that's not true, but it's also a much longer story. So the pandemic experience really shaped and crystallized a good deal of the conversation that took place during our sessions. It also brought most of us to virtual meetings as quite a powerful tool in the toolbox for anyone involved in community mobilization. So that was sort of a side positive that I think many of us took away. The occupations and the war didn't have much impact on our conversations since they'd already taken place by then, but they both added urgency to the issues that our participants were dealing with. And they created a political atmosphere where there's even less free space to move towards solutions, at least for now.
Wow, Mitchell, what a superb summary of the recent events and how they shaped the discourse. That was really excellent. Everything you said really points to, both a greater urgency around these challenges, but also less action and political will, which is not maybe the most hopeful message. But I agree, this is sort of what we're living through right now. So Sheila, I wanted to ask you, because you've been advocating for basic income policies for many years. And despite all the worrying trends of the past couple of years, and Mitchell did a great job outlining those, are there also some reasons for hope?
I think so, absolutely. One of the really interesting things for us that happened during COVID was the fact of the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. We had heard years and years of all of this is too hard, we can't do it, the federal government doesn't have the capacity to deliver the kind of income security we need. So the CERB was not a basic income, it had some really serious flaws, but it showed that our government can actually respond and quickly and really make a difference when they put their minds to it. And I think there were so many people who thought they would never, ever be in a circumstance where they would need that kind of support. The other thing that I found really remarkable, we had invited people to provide CERB stories to us. And a lot of them talked about having breathing room for the first time ever. These hardworking people who have got 2 and 3 jobs, everybody's struggling to get by. And that just made a huge difference. So, it's the pandemic benefits have largely gone now. The government seemed to think this is all over and we can just get on with it. And I think, more recent statistics coming out are going to show that we probably got worse problems than we went in with, but you can't unlearn CERB. People had that experience. Many people had that experience that never would have before. So yeah, and it takes political pressure to keep things going. So many of the solutions that came out of these conversations are about building synergies and understanding these connections. And we just have to keep working on the kinds of solutions that are going to solve multiple problems rather than all of this siloed activity that tends to go on. So I'm hopeful that can happen. There are champions in Parliament both on the climate side and on the income security side. More and more people within political parties, I think at the grassroots level, are getting it. And regular people are starting to really understand how much the world has changed and how we need better public policy. So
yeah, so thank you. Some reason to hope there. And we need to find the silver linings where we can these days, right? Mitchell, how about you?
No, just to add to that really quickly, I keep thinking of a line that comes out of climate and clean energy work about policymakers and decision makers and assumptions and lobbyists who spend all of their time trying to prove that something can't possibly work in theory that works perfectly well in practice. And what's great, as Sheila said so much better, what's great about the CERB is that nobody will ever be able to sell that again. They might be able to win the decision, they won't be able to win the argument. And I think that does open up so much space for advocacy. And there are the equivalent stories on the climate side as well.
Yeah, totally. I'm just seeing the time, the hour has flown by and we're just wrapping up in a couple minutes, but I did want to mention there were a couple, I've been monitoring the chat and I thank you for your questions, Brad and Anna. And Anna, our panelist, has been responding, but I wanted to ask any other panelists if they had responses. Essentially, the two questions are around kind of what next, what do we do with these recommendations? So there was a question around, is there a plan to feed this into the federal government's work on their Just Transitions Act? And another related one on how do you approach government institutions to disseminate their results? And in what format are you sharing the results from these community conversations? So does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, just quickly,
sorry. Oh.
Go ahead.
I'll just say real quick, we brought it up, Iron Earth brought up we were invited to one of the Natural Resources Canada consultations. We brought it up. And from my end, I am involved. I answered this on the chat, but like we are bringing up those answers and those, I'm to all of our coalitions for just transition, for like to push towards legislation. We're building one in Alberta, we're building one in Newfoundland and Labrador, we're building one in Ontario. I mean, there's groups across the nation that are building that one. And so I'm kind of like the Green Resilience Project, like a major cheerleader, in which I'm just keeping like, this is a report that came out and it's great. Let's take it out. Because a lot of times people, even in the Natural Resources Canada consultation, it was hilarious. The government was like, we need to talk to people. And I was like, actually, we've talked to people and they want basic income. And this is the report. So that kind of is how we're doing it. But anyways.
Fantastic. No, thanks. Any quick reflections, Mitchell, from you, and then we'll wrap up?
Just the quick point that, the horrible realization that this was a project that was funded on a federal fiscal year so that it ran out March 31st. And somehow neither the climate emergency nor the affordability emergency got solved by then. Who knew, right? So we are laying the groundwork and plotting great plans for phase 2. So I'll just say watch this space. We're not there yet, but we are
stay
stopping.
tuned. Yeah, you aren't stopping. Awesome. Stay tuned. Yeah, much more work to be done here. Well, hey, thank you to all of you for being here today, for sharing your amazing insights. Thank you to everyone in the audience who joined and for your interest in this topic. Just a reminder, we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording and additional resources. Everything that was shared in the chat will be sent. And we have an upcoming webinar you might be interested in on multi-solving. So we will put the link in the chat and send it in the email as well, but wanted to share that with you. So for any additional questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to reach out to me at any time. There's my email address. Thank you for being here today, everyone. Take care.